Well, as the only non-Jew in the room, I do have a question, and I'm not trying to belittle you or attack you or harass you in any way, but I am curious about this.
Mm.
Supposedly, in order to get rid of sin, you have to sacrifice an animal, or at least that's what the Old Testament claimed. What do you guys do now when you need to get rid of sin?
So we do the same thing we did back then. We repent. A sacrifice without intention, without kavanah, without putting your heart in the right place first was meaningless. In the non-Jewish world, they developed this notion, I guess it was originally a Jewish idea, that we were doing more than just what God told us to do when we to keep the law. We are in some way trying to get into heaven, right? Like, what do you do with sin? Why is that such a problem? Oh, well, because a sinful man can't stand before a holy God. You have a preconceived notion that the Torah is telling you to prepare yourself for an afterlife. Not really. The Torah is trying to make you a better citizen. The Torah was given in an agrarian society. God and people really should be more preoccupied with getting yourself fixed and the result of getting yourself fixed on this planet here and now than what happens tomorrow. It seems that nowadays, the whole purpose of repenting and even offering sacrifices is to be able to enter heaven. But I'm pretty sure that didn't cross the minds of the early Israelites. They did good for the sake of doing good. They knew that for their country to move forward ethically, they had to keep this law. And this law didn't curse you with hell if you didn't keep it or promise you heaven if you did. It seems that every punishment was reciprocal in each law. It says if you do X, Y, and Z, you won't see rain in its season. If you don't honor your parents, you won't have a long life. It seems it was all about a here and now. So if it's all about here and now, people don't ask these questions like, what do you do with sin? Well, I mean, sin is not a separate entity. Sin is the result of not doing the right thing. So the answer to that is you start doing the right thing, not whether God forgives you or not. God forgives you once you forgive yourself and you're able to move on and not make the mistake over and over again. You see, like people have become so heavenly minded that they're not earthly minded anymore. They don't give a crap about this world. And the grossest example of this is Muslims blowing themselves up just to get to the afterlife because this world is just not good enough or even worth living. Now, this is not something invented by the Muslims. It says in Pirkei Avot that this world is just like the corridor and it's the next world. I think that statement is completely nonsensical. Pirkei Avot is not a halacha sefer. It's a Musar sefer. But you don't have to take what it says literally. It's optional to believe, but I think that in itself was bad advice. But the simple fact that Chazal also contradict that elsewhere, that those who live for just the next world, right? Those who ask, what comes after? What came before? What's above? What's below? It's better that he was never born. I've seen people learn Pirkei Avot like they're learning Bereshit or like Shmot or the halachic portions of the Mishnah.
I know the Christians talk in their so-called prophecy of the sacrifices being continued in Israel, that they need the ashes of a red heifer and they need all this other stuff. And so I'm just wondering, what is your perception on that? Do you think that animal sacrifice would return to Israel, or do you think it's all a bunch of hooey, or what do you think?
It's not a Christian concept, it's a Jewish concept. The Torah tells us to sacrifice animals, but it doesn't really tell us why to do it. Torah itself says that the secret things are for God and only what he's revealed to us is for us to do. That's what he cares about. And in my opinion, anything having to do with korbanot or sacrifices or mitzvot that make no sense to us, that is what's secret. Secret in the sense that anything you have to say about it is only going to be conjecture. Who knows? The Bible is silent about all these mitzvot that make no sense. So what God's telling you is that don't worry about those. Just do them because he says to do them, all right? But focus on the ones that do make sense, even though you still have to keep them both. But that opens the doors for the charlatans to create cults and take money from people trying to say, well, we have the true interpretation of what that means. Atonement, how can you get into heaven? How can you please God? God tells you how he's pleased by you keeping his commandments. That's it. That whether it gets you to heaven or not, he tells you what are the rewards for keeping the bulk of the mitzvot, and it's typically heaven on earth, seeing your children grow old, peace. What else is there? Now you have people living solely for the next world. I think if God wanted us to worry about the next world, he would have mentioned it more in the Torah, and he doesn't. I mean, Gehenna is not mentioned. I mean, like Gei Behinom is a place outside the walls of the old city currently, right?
Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to bring up. If you thought that, because that's what I'd heard, is that that whole concept was something that they used to do back in ancient times. They would take these diseased bodies and put them outside the city walls and burn them outside the city walls, and
Right.
that's how that whole thing of the flames and stuff all got started. That's what I had heard anyway.
Virtually everything mystical in our belief system first began as a legal precept, but people get bored with what's plain and legal, and they need something more exciting, so they give it a mystical twist. The problem is you keep on twisting, you end up with something that doesn't resemble what you started off with, and then people start calling that Judaism, and that's the problem. So I try to keep people grounded. I'm like, well, first let's see what the Torah says. All right, okay, the Torah endorses laws developed by the Shoftim, by judges. That's all we're expected to do from God, and everything else is just like the icing on the cake. If you want to study Kabbalah, if you want to study the Zohar, just know that that's optional. Right? I mean, don't condemn other people just because he belongs to a different philosophy, a different dynasty, only because he differs from the Zohar. So I'm not against Kabbalah, but I'm against people not making a distinction and calling it all Torah. To get back to your first question, how do people find atonement today? First of all, atonement is typically tied to the land. Atonement can only really be acquired while you're in the land. What we're looking for now is forgiveness. When you're in exile and you repent, like it says in the end of Deuteronomy and the end of Leviticus, like first it breaks down sin, exile, and redemption. The formula for sin, exile, and redemption is that when you begin to stray away from the mitzvot, from the commandments, like it says in Deuteronomy chapter 18, it says that he's going to raise up for you a prophet when you begin to emulate the nations of the world. So that's prophetic intervention first. He gives you a chance. If you don't listen to the prophets, then he exiles you. How do we know? I mean, apart from it saying it in the Torah itself, because this is in our first exile. So we've seen this happen before with the Assyrian exile, with the Babylonian exile, and now we're in the Roman exile. And then if you repent in the collective, if the Jewish people repent, God is faithful to forgive you, not atone for you. He forgives you in exile. And then when he brings you back to the land and you're established in some messianic fashion, I mean, that's what Yemot HaMashiach, the messianic age, is any age that Israel is living in their land in an elevated state, that they have a temple, they're keeping the laws the way God expected them to be kept. When you're at that level, then atonement can begin in many different ways. The Mizbeach is atoned for. Also, that we're actually keeping the korbanot properly, so Yom Kippur also brings atonement. So atonement and forgiveness is not really the same thing, but for Christians, they combine the two. Now, I could give really my opinion of what I think atonement is versus forgiveness, but the Torah really doesn't say. You really have to sort of go in and see like when that word is used. That when the word kapar in terms to cover, but in my opinion, I think it's more of a resetting. That he resets you just so you can live another year in the land. So when you cease to receive atonement from God, that's when he exiles you. So this is why Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is so important. Rosh Hashanah is known as also Yom Hadin, which is the day that he judges you. And Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. If he actually finds you favorable to live in the land another year, during Yom Kippur is when that atonement would occur. But every year, Israel's deeds are weighed to see if they could remain in the land. It's all tied into the land. It's hard to understand Judaism detached from the land of Israel. But what we see nowadays with Chabad and all these organizations, that what you see is what's called Galut Judaism. And this is why it really doesn't make sense going back to the land. It's a Judaism that was created in exile, which is why it's so uber spiritual. Now, spirituality is not bad as long as you're able to make a distinction of where you came from and where you are now, and God willing, how can we go back to that, right? But it seems like we don't want to go back.
So you don't think Trump making Jerusalem the capital of Israel has any major significance whatsoever then?
Jerusalem has always been the capital of Israel. Since it became the capital,